Hi, Steve Dayock here. It's that time of year again. I understand Don Trump and Joe Biden will be attending the annual 9/11 memorial ceremony at Shanksville, Pennsylvania on Friday. If that's true, no more proof is needed to know that both of these candidates are puppets for the military-industrial complex because, as I'll explain, there was no jet crash at Shanksville. For those who can't remember, Flight 93 was the 9/11 flight where the passengers fought back. And in the struggle, the hijackers lost control, and the jet plummeted into an abandoned strip mine in Pennsylvania, the ground of which swallowed the jet whole and then closed behind it like the mouth of a tomb. Yes, they insist the 757 burrowed into the ground. It's a great story. The Shanksville chapter was a necessary addition to the 9/11 story because without Flight 93, the narrative was only an attack on corporate and military power. For people in the street who have no sympathy for corporations and who think the military can take care of itself, there was no guarantee there would be enough outrage to support a never-ending war on terror. But with Flight 93, the narrative became an attack on America itself, and no one messes with baseball, mom, and apple pie without paying the price. If endless war was the goal, Shanksville sealed the deal. With COVID-19 blowing everyone's mojo, it may seem irrelevant to discuss the events of September 11th, 2001, but I heard somewhere that those who do not learn from the past are condemned to repeat it. Considering the USA has been at war for most of the last 240 years, an honest observer would conclude that the history being taught in state-run schools is just state propaganda, with COVID-19 being the latest chapter. That all the world's governments marched in lockstep to lock down their respective populations is all anyone needs to know that this is a false pandemic. Remember, these are the same governments that continue to parrot the fantasies of September 11th, 2001, when they broadcast fraudulent footage of jets hitting the Twin Towers and called it news. The golden rule sardonically refers to the fact that the person with the gold gets to make the rules, and the person with the most gold gets to make the most rules. The world's wealthiest few may compete and collude, just like we little people do, think of wars and alliances, but when the system that keeps them in power is threatened, they will always circle the wagons and work together. Think of the Bilderberg conferences. In his book, The Art of War, Sun Tzu stressed the importance of knowing your enemy. If you haven't figured out by now that the enemy of we the people of all nations is that elusive 1%, then you haven't been paying attention. They govern us, they educate and entertain us, they control almost all the information we and our parents have ever been exposed to. Everything we think we know, everything we think we relate to, ought to be suspect as the desired result of their unsubtle brainwashing programs. They have more in common with each other than they do with the common people of their countries, and the common people between countries have more in common with each other than we do with the richest 1%. No doubt the concept of national borders means something different to them than it does to us. What we are experiencing is an undeclared class war. It has been this way since the invention of money, and unless you can count yourself as fabulously wealthy, you're losing. The easiest way to expose the fraud is by applying the scientific method to their lies, and the easiest lie to expose is the story of Flight 93 and Shanksville, Pennsylvania. The scientific method is described by Encyclopedia Britannica as the technique used in the construction and testing of a scientific hypothesis. According to NASA, the elongated gashes seen at Shanksville are predictable and reproducible with projectiles striking at trajectories of less than 10 degrees from horizontal. By mirroring the images, it can be seen what a crater might look like had two projectiles struck from opposite directions. These mirrored images are dead ringers for the Shanksville crater, indicating it was not created by the crashing of a large jet, but by the oblique impacts of small projectiles. The most likely weapons I've found that can account for the evidence as seen are bunker-busting cruise missiles, which witnesses did report seeing and hearing in the area. Susan McElwain saw a small white plane no wider than her van, which flew under the power lines right over her van before swooping up over the trees, banking, and crashing. A Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missile, or JSAM, which used off-the-shelf technology from other tried-and-true weapon systems, looks like a small white plane and has the capabilities to accomplish what she described. McElwain also described seeing 2 jet fighters at a very high altitude. JSAMs happen to be air-launched from such jets. Upon closer investigation of the crash site, it can be seen that there were actually 2 smaller craters flanking the large central crater. That makes 3 craters and 3 gashes, 2 bigger gashes for the wings and 1 smaller one for the tail. According to NASA, the tail gash was cut with a smaller projectile impacting at a shallower angle of attack than what cut the larger wing gashes. Something like a Hydra 70 rocket fits the bill, and as it turns out, in addition to the jet fighters seen at a high altitude, an A-10 Thunderbolt, or Warthog, was seen in the area at a low altitude. Warthogs can carry Hydra 70 rockets. So the 3 gashes were created with 3 projectiles, and the 3 craters were created with 3 explosives. Despite what most people want to believe about what happened at Shanksville, the physical evidence supports the conclusion that the military launched a rocket and some missiles into the ground and called it a plane crash. To test this hypothesis, I used a tub of moistened sand, topped with colored sand for contrast, and fired various projectiles into it at trajectories of less than 10 degrees. I found it very difficult to reproduce them with a ricochet bullet or pellet. The impact from the projectile left a big crater, just like the NASA experiments did, but I didn't have the velocity of the NASA projectiles to cut the elongated gash with the ricochet. I didn't have the benefit of a hypervelocity gun. Besides, to test my hypothesis, the projectile must be buried underground. I needed something more missile-shaped, more massive, and traveling much slower than a bullet. Where are Mythbusters when you need them, huh? What I ended up with was a miniature crossbow bolt. At much lower velocities than those of bullets and pellets, but with much more mass focused on a small point of impact, the missile-shaped projectiles easily buried underground while leaving the elongated gash I expected. So, however simplistic my humble experiment was, it is still empirical evidence in support of the conclusion that precision munitions such as cruise missiles and rockets are the most likely suspects for the Shanksville crash site. Even NASA's experiments support this conclusion, and I'm sure any police ballistics department will too. It's not rocket science. Whether or not Flight 93 ever existed, it did not burrow into the ground at Shanksville. Evidently, the military used off-the-shelf munitions to create the crash site as a way to drum up enough public outrage to support long-planned wars of aggression. Why this evidence is ignored by every nation on Earth, as well as everyone from the FBI to the 9/11 Truth Movement, ought to be obvious, because it exposes all governments as complicit and the opposition as controlled. The military minds and critical thinkers of the so-called enemy nations would have surely recognized missile impacts on site and would know that the U.S. military has the largest arsenal of cruise missiles on Earth and that the U.S. military was tasked with defending America's airspace. They would know that if the U.S. didn't launch the missiles, a third-party nation did, which would make the U.S. military too incompetent to defend America, something I doubt anyone believes. There is no pretty way to paint this picture. The evidence of the use of cruise missiles changes everything about what we thought we knew about 9/11, about America, but it also changes everything about what we thought we knew about the global balance of power. The U.S. would never have attempted such a ruse against its own people without first ensuring that the enemy nations that allegedly have every reason for doing so, nations like China, Iran, North Korea, and Russia, wouldn't expose them. Apparently all the world is a stage, but we're not so much players as we are being played. If America's alleged foes are anything like what they are advertised to be, they would have already exposed the fraud of September 11th and the War on Terror. But they didn't, and they don't. They are on the same page with NATO and the USA about 9/11, and they are on the same page about COVID-19. So this is the new world order that George Bush Sr. promised us so many years ago. But the new world order is just the old world order with better graphics. And in case you hadn't noticed, the old world order was all about slavery. Indeed, what is history but a fable agreed upon? 19 years ago, 19 hijackers paved the way for COVID-19. Our shared nightmare began with Bush, was expanded by Obama, and perpetuated by Trump. This year's candidates will be at Shanksville to prop up a lie that ought to insult the intelligence of any thinking person. But since good propaganda targets emotion, not reason, thinking has nothing to do with it. But if you're tired of the charade, the truth isn't hard to find if you know where to look. Start with Shanksville. Anyone who insists a 757 cut that odd-shaped gash is either a liar or a fool, including and especially presidential candidates. It's up to you to stop believing them, so on this September 11th, try something different. Try the truth. Thank you.